Hi, thank you for joining. This alt.chi paper is about citational justice in HCI, or whether and how our citational practices recognize voices that have historically been located on the margins of HCI knowledge production. Why braving? Because recognizing our complicity in citational injustices and our role in working towards citational justice calls for courage. Here we speak and write as scholars of Indian origin who have conducted research in marginalized settings while being part of elite institutions in the United States. We draw from our own experiences of citing and not citing, being cited and not being cited. And we ask you to connect with this conversation as it resonates best in the context of your work. We began thinking deeply about citational justice in November 2019 when an article in the Interactions magazine called us out for missing an important citation. We wrote an article titled Intersectional Computing, but missed seeing a paper by Thomas and colleagues that had written about intersectional computing just shortly before us. As we came to grasp the broader implications of this omission, we saw how it connected with deeper structural issues tied to erasure of Black scholarship. In making sense of this Interactions article and our own culpability, we came to ask more questions, such as why do we cite how we cite? And in the process, who do we omit to cite and why? Where does that responsibility lie? Is it with an individual or the institutions that we're a part of? Also, more fundamentally, what do we think of as good work? Because that is the work that we end up citing.
Papers have politics. Through citing and not citing, they shape knowledge production. Here we join a growing coalition of voices to discuss the politics of knowledge production and epistemic injustice in HCI. For example, Dillahunt discusses subfield bias against certain topics and methods in HCI. Anonymous and colleagues and Arete and colleagues, respectively, discuss the epistemic violence perpetrated against researchers with disabilities and against Black women in the HCI community. A growing body of work in HCI and beyond demonstrates how citations exercise agency in knowledge production, often according to these biases. For example, they show us how ideas are valued or not. They can also distort, amplify, and erase work over time. We're not the first to want to ensure citational practices amplify marginalized voices. There are database repositories of work by groups that have been marginalized in knowledge production. For example, Cite Her by Black Compute Her. Researchers have long been creating new social networks to learn about who does what work and amplify scholars from marginalized groups. For example, through workshops and networks like People of Color Also Know Stuff in political science. Zines, blogs, and other scholarship have discussed how to improve citational practices, such as Amrute and colleagues' How to Cite Like a Badass Tech Feminist Scholar of Color. And there have been efforts across academic institutions around centering work done by different marginalized groups. Viewing citations as relationships instead of a distribution of wealth, we find that citations do or do not make it into a paper based on who we look for, who we relate to, who our peers expect us to cite. This relational framing that we offer in our paper gives us a path forward to enact citational justice. Young has argued for the notion of political responsibility, where we all must recognize that we have a duty to transform structures of injustice. In taking responsibility, we must develop a critical consciousness of oppression, as Freire argues. We must unlearn biases and learn how various forms of oppression shape citational practices and knowledge production more broadly. With this critical consciousness, we are better equipped to take a collective action. But as Young says, all of this is only possible when we have the courage to recognize our complicity. Our work is thus a call to action. We can use citations as anti-racist feminist technologies, for example, by using them to cite scholars of color. We can use them to draw out connections between isolated nodes of knowledge, honoring commonalities and differences. For example, recognizing that work done in disparate geographies could productively inform each other. We also need to break the culture of silence, which Freire says is necessary for developing a critical consciousness. With citations, this might mean normalizing talking about citational injustices and asking for recognition of scholars on the margins. Finally, we can push institutions and research communities to justly evaluate work, awards, and promotions in light of issues like subfield bias. We can question supposedly objective criteria used to gatekeep scholarship, admissions, and hiring. We can also consider how our reviewing practices impact citational justice and disincentivize reviewing behaviors that fail to recognize the politics of knowledge production. This journey to strengthen our citational practices is ongoing, and we welcome feedback and dialogue as we work as a community to brave citational justice in HCI. Thank you.